The courtroom was filled to the brim that morning. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of families, reporters, and curious onlookers. The air felt heavy, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something important to unfold. The walls were tall and gray, lined with shelves of law books that no one dared to touch. The large clock ticked loudly, reminding everyone that time inside these walls moved slower than anywhere else. At the front sat the judge, an older man with sharp eyes hidden behind glasses. He carried the kind of presence that made even the most confident people lower their voices. His gavel rested on the desk in front of him, and every time he tapped it, the entire room jumped. The lawyers, dressed in dark suits, sat at their tables with stacks of papers, files, and notes. Some whispered quickly to their clients, others adjusted their ties nervously, but all the attention wasn't really on them. People in the courtroom weren't here to watch the lawyers argue. They were waiting for a different kind of moment. The case had already stretched for weeks, dragging in witnesses, statements, and endless back-and-forth debates. Yet there was one witness everyone whispered about, the one no one expected to hold much weight but whose presence carried something unusual. A little boy. In the second row next to a woman who kept squeezing his hand for comfort, sat a black little boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. His feet dangled above the floor, unable to touch it. His small hands clutched the side of his seat tightly, his knuckles white from nerves. From a distance, he looked fragile, far too young to be part of such a serious case. Most of the crowd looked at him with curiosity, some with pity and a few with doubt. What could a child possibly add to a courtroom filled with adults? The boy looked around the room with wide eyes. Everything seemed bigger than him. The high ceiling, the towering shelves, the stern faces staring at him from every angle. Even the judge's chair seemed impossibly tall, like a throne from which decisions that could change lives were made. Every sound was sharper in his ears. The shuffle of papers, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of 2 journalists in the corner. He sat quietly, not saying a word, but inside his chest his heart beat fast and heavy. Across the room at the defense table sat a police officer. His uniform was neatly pressed, his hat placed on the table beside him. He wore the kind of smirk that came from confidence, the kind that said, "I know nothing can touch me." His arms were folded across his chest as he leaned back in his chair, watching the boy with an expression that mixed dismissal and amusement. He didn't look worried. To him, the boy was just a child, too young, too scared, too unimportant to be taken seriously. The crowd seemed to share that feeling. They didn't expect much. Some even whispered to one another that this part of the trial was unnecessary. "He's just a kid," one man murmured to his neighbor. "What difference can he make?" The neighbor shrugged, already preparing for the boy to stumble over his words. The entire room carried the same assumption. Children can't shake a courtroom, but the boy's mother knew otherwise. She sat beside him, gently squeezing his hand, her eyes filled with both fear and pride. She knew what he had seen. She knew what he was about to say. And while her heart ached for the pressure her son was about to face, she also understood that his words could make a difference no adult had managed to. The judge called for order, his voice echoing through the room. "Bring in the next witness." All heads turned. The bailiff stepped forward, walking toward the bench where witnesses spoke their truth. Slowly, carefully, the boy stood. His legs trembled slightly, and he leaned for a moment on his mother's hand before taking his first step forward. The courtroom seemed to grow even quieter. The rustle of papers stopped. The whispers hushed. Even the officer's smirk faltered just for a second as the boy's small figure made its way to the witness chair. Each step echoed louder than it should have, as though the wooden floor itself wanted the world to listen. When the boy reached the stand, the bailiff helped him climb onto the chair. His small body looked even smaller against the tall wooden frame. The microphone was adjusted to his level, but his voice still sounded soft when he gave the oath, promising to tell the truth. Some people in the back smiled faintly, believing his voice was too innocent to carry any real weight. But there was something in the boy's eyes that others missed. Behind the fear, behind the nerves, there was determination. His gaze, though small and unsure, carried a glimmer of strength. He didn't look away from the judge. He didn't look at the crowd. He sat up straighter than before, his hands folding neatly in front of him, as if bracing himself for something much bigger than his size. The judge gave a small nod, and one of the lawyers stepped forward. The boy was now the center of attention, the entire courtroom leaning in as though the air itself had shifted. The moment had come. The child no one expected to matter was about to speak, and though the room didn't know it yet, his words would change everything. The little boy sat stiffly in the large wooden chair, his back barely touching the tall backrest. His feet dangled helplessly above the floor, swinging slightly every time his knees trembled. The microphone in front of him seemed enormous, and when it picked up the faint sound of his breathing, he quickly pressed his lips together, afraid of making too much noise. He was the smallest person in the entire courtroom. Yet in that moment, it felt like the entire weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. His eyes darted around nervously. He saw strangers everywhere. Men in suits, women with notepads, police officers with sharp expressions. The room was too bright, the lights too harsh, making his face warm. He wanted to shrink into himself, to disappear into the wooden chair, but he knew he couldn't. They had called his name. They wanted him here. And deep inside he remembered his mother's words whispered into his ear just before he stood up. Tell the truth. Don't be afraid. Just tell the truth. But fear was already clawing at him. The courtroom felt like a cage, and every set of eyes staring at him were the bars. He could hear people whispering from the benches behind him. Some were curious, some doubtful, and others already dismissing him. He's just a child, someone muttered. What could he possibly know? The boy's ears burned at their words. He wished he were invisible. The judge cleared his throat, his voice deep and commanding. Do you understand why you are here, son? The boy swallowed hard and gave the smallest nod. His voice was stuck, trembling in his chest. He wanted to speak, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let the words come out. The lawyer leaned closer, his tone gentle but still intimidating. Don't be afraid. Just answer the questions truthfully. The boy nodded again, but his small hands gripped the edge of the chair tighter, his fingers pressing hard against the wood. Across the room, the police officer leaned back casually in his chair, arms folded, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His eyes gleamed with arrogance as if he already knew how this would end. He looked at the boy the same way one might look at a broken toy. Amused, confident, dismissive. The boy noticed the smirk and his heart sank further. How could he, a child, stand against someone like that? His breathing grew quicker. He could feel the sweat forming on his palms, making them slippery against the polished wood. He wanted to cry, but he knew if he did, the officer would laugh, the crowd would whisper, and no one would ever believe him. He remembered the nights he had cried at home, hiding his face in his pillow so his mother wouldn't hear. But this was different. This wasn't home. This was a place where his voice could either vanish into nothing or finally be heard. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, bringing the room back to silence. Take your time, he said firmly, his voice carrying authority but also patience. No one here will rush you. But the boy didn't believe that. Everyone was rushing him with their eyes, their silence, their expectation. He glanced at his mother in the crowd. She was sitting upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her lips pressed together as though she were holding back her own fear. When his eyes met hers, she gave him the smallest nod, her gaze steady and warm. For a brief moment, he felt a little strength flow into him. He took a shaky breath and tried to steady his voice. Yes, I understand, he whispered. The words were almost too soft to hear, but the microphone carried them through the room. A murmur ran through the crowd. He had spoken. The lawyer smiled slightly and asked the next question, but even then the boy's voice trembled like a candle flame in the wind. Inside, he was still terrified. Every time the officer shifted in his chair, the boy flinched. Every time someone in the gallery coughed or whispered, his heart jumped. But with each word he managed to say, something inside him began to change. Fear was still there, heavy and cold, but underneath it a tiny spark of courage began to glow. That courage would soon grow stronger. But for now, he sat trembling in the Witten. The judge's gavel slammed against the bench. Order! His voice cut through the noise, but even he had to strike it twice to calm the storm that had erupted. The crowd stilled again, but the damage was done. The boy's words had cracked the courtroom open, and nothing could silence what had already been spoken. The defense lawyer rose quickly, his face pale but his tone forceful. Your Honor, he barked, this is outrageous. The testimony of a child, clearly unreliable, clearly manipulated, should not be allowed to sway this court. He is young, confused, and impressionable. This is nothing but emotional play. The boy, hearing those words, gripped the sides of the chair tighter. For a moment fear crept back in. But then he remembered the officer's threat, the cold warning that no one would ever believe him. That memory lit a fire inside him, pushing him past the fear. He leaned toward the microphone, his small voice cutting through the lawyer's thunder. "I'm not lying," he said firmly, louder this time. His voice echoed, surprising even himself. "I remember everything. He told me to stay quiet. But I won't stay quiet anymore," the crowd gasped. A woman in the back put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. A man shook his head slowly, whispering, "Did you hear that?" He said the officer threatened him. The reporters' pens moved even faster, their notes capturing every syllable. The officer shifted again, his chair squeaking under him. He tried to steady his face, tried to force back his smirk, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously around the room, avoiding the boy's gaze. The jury noticed. The judge noticed. Everyone noticed. The shockwave grew. It was no longer whispers. It was a storm inside every person present. The jurors' expressions hardened, some narrowing their eyes at the officer, others glancing at the boy with newfound respect. The spectators, once doubtful, now leaned in, captivated by the power of the smallest voice in the room. Even the judge, his face stern, allowed a flicker of surprise to pass across his eyes before he regained control. The defense lawyer tried again, his voice rising, his hand slamming against the table. "He's just a child. You cannot possibly take this seriously." But it was too late. The seriousness was already carved into the silence that followed the boy's words. The weight of his testimony had shifted the entire atmosphere. No one in that room could dismiss what they had just witnessed. The courage, the clarity, the unwavering truth in a child's voice had pierced through the courtroom's walls of power and authority. The officer's mask was cracking. Each bead of sweat, each twitch of his jaw, each nervous glance chipped away at the image he had built. Once he had looked untouchable. Now, under the stare of a boy no older than 9, he looked fragile, guilty, and small. The courtroom was no longer the officer's domain. It no longer belonged to the lawyers or even the judge. In that moment, it belonged to the boy, the smallest person in the room, who had unleashed the largest shockwave the case had ever seen. And as the silence settled once more, everyone understood that nothing would be the same after that testimony. The truth had been spoken, and it was impossible to unhear. The air in the courtroom was still vibrating from the boy's bold words. His accusation had landed like lightning, shaking every corner of the room. But storms are always followed by struggle. And now the defense lawyer rose slowly, smoothing the front of his suit with a trembling but practiced hand. His face carried a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a mask of confidence stretched over deep worry. He approached the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps, his shoes echoing on the polished wooden floor. Every step seemed designed to remind the boy and the jury that he was the adult, the professional, the authority in the room. When he finally stood before the child, he leaned slightly on the podium, lowering his voice into a tone that was supposed to sound calm but came out sharp, like a knife hidden behind velvet. "Son," he began, drawing out the word, "you're very brave to come here today. But sometimes children confuse things. Sometimes they think they see something, but really it's their imagination. You understand what I mean, don't you?" The boy looked at him, his lips pressed tightly together. For a moment, fear flickered again in his eyes. The lawyer saw it and pressed harder. "You're young, very young. And it was dark that night, wasn't it?" His voice grew smoother, dripping with false kindness. "It's easy for a child to make a mistake, to think they saw something when they really didn't." The boy's hands gripped the edges of the wooden chair until his knuckles turned white. He felt the weight of the lawyer's words, the condescension pressing against him like a wall. He wanted to shrink, to nod and escape the heavy stare. The officer sat taller now, a faint smirk crawling back to his lips as if he believed the boy was about to fold under pressure. But then, the boy remembered. He remembered the sound of his uncle crying out. He remembered the way the officer's shadow had fallen across the alley, the flash of anger in his eyes, the cold command, "Stay quiet. No one will believe you." That memory burned brighter than his fear. He lifted his chin slightly, his small voice breaking through the lawyer's calm manipulation. "I know what I saw," the boy said firmly. The lawyer's smile twitched, but he didn't give up. He stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "But you're just a boy. How can you be so sure? Adults struggle to remember details, but you—" He paused, lowering his head to the boy's eye level. "You were scared, weren't you? And scared children often imagine things." The boy's lips trembled, but his eyes didn't look away. "I wasn't imagining." He looked right at me. His voice cracked slightly, but his words were clear. He knew I saw him. A murmur swept through the room again. The jurors leaned in, studying the boy carefully. His small frame shook, but there was no mistaking the honesty in his eyes. The lawyer straightened, his patience fraying. His tone grew harsher now. You're saying in front of this court that you are more reliable than a decorated police officer? That your word, a child's word, should outweigh his. The boy didn't hesitate this time. His answer came like a spark in the silence. Yes, because I'm telling the truth, the crowd gasped. The officer's smirk vanished again, his jaw tightening. His hands clenched on the table. The lawyer's face reddened, and he tried one last tactic, mockery. Tell me then, child, what exactly did he do? What exactly did you see? Or will your story change again under pressure? The boy leaned toward the microphone, his small voice steady but powerful. I saw him hit my uncle. I saw him push him to the ground. I saw him point his gun at people who tried to help. And I saw him look at me and say nobody would believe me. The lawyer froze. His mouth opened, but no words came. The courtroom had erupted once more into whispers and gasps, the shock rolling through every row. The judge slammed the gavel, but even his booming command couldn't erase the truth that now hung in the air. The boy had not only held his ground under fire, he had become stronger. Every question, every attempt to confuse or intimidate him, only sharpened the honesty of his words. The jurors could see it. The crowd could feel it. The officer could sense it. The smallest witness had just become the most powerful voice in the courtroom, and in that moment the balance of the case tilted further, the mighty shield of authority cracking under the weight of a child's unshakable truth. The courtroom felt different now. What had begun as a place where the officer walked in with power and confidence had shifted into a stage where a child's voice carried more weight than all the polished suits, the flashing badges, and the rehearsed arguments. The jury sat straighter, their pens paused mid-air. Their eyes, once skeptical, were fixed on the boy. Some of them looked as though they had forgotten to breathe. The boy sat small in the witness chair, his feet still dangling above the floor, but he no longer looked fragile. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted just slightly, his gaze steady. Fear had not disappeared. His hands still trembled, but courage had grown stronger, wrapping itself around every word he spoke. Across the room, the officer shifted in his seat. The smirk he had worn so confidently earlier was gone, replaced by clenched teeth and restless eyes. He tapped his fingers against the table, a small nervous rhythm that betrayed his unraveling composure. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something quickly, but the officer jerked his arm away, his pride fighting against the panic building inside him. The jurors noticed. The crowd noticed. Everyone noticed. The prosecutor, sensing the moment, rose again. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the power of a man who knew the tide had turned. You've told us what you saw, he said to the boy. Do you have any doubt about who did these things? The boy's eyes shifted briefly to the officer, then back to the lawyer. His answer came without hesitation. No, I don't have doubt. It was him. He lifted his finger once more, pointing firmly at the officer, his voice sharper now, almost ringing with determination. It was that man. The courtroom gasped again. This time no one laughed. No one doubted. Even the defense lawyer, who had fought to twist the boy's words, could feel the walls closing in. The judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing at the officer. He had seen countless witnesses, endless testimonies, and thousands of lies pass through his courtroom. But there was no lie in the boy's face. The simplicity, the clarity, the unshakable truth, it was undeniable. One juror, a middle-aged woman, folded her arms across her chest, her eyes fixed on the officer with growing suspicion. Another juror, an older man with silver hair, scribbled notes rapidly, his lips pressed thin, his expression stern. They were no longer dismissing the child. They were measuring the officer. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. People who had come expecting drama now found themselves gripped by something much heavier. A child's words had cut through all the layers of power and pretense, leaving the truth bare for everyone to see. The officer tried to steady himself, sitting taller, his jaw tight. But every movement looked forced, every breath too quick. The jury could see it. The boy could see it. The once mighty figure of authority looked smaller with every second. The boy's mother, seated in the gallery, pressed her hands against her mouth, her eyes wet with tears. Pride and fear mixed in her expression. She had raised her son to tell the truth, but even she hadn't expected his voice to shake the world this way. The judge struck the gavel once, not for order, but as if to mark the gravity of the moment. "The witness has spoken clearly," he said firmly. His voice echoed across the room, sending a tremor through the officer's body. It was the turning point everyone had felt building, but hadn't admitted until now. The case was no longer about polished arguments or rehearsed defenses. It had become about a child's truth against an officer's silence. And in that battle, the child was winning. The officer looked around the room, his eyes darting desperately, searching for someone, anyone, who still believed in him. But the stares that met him were no longer filled with respect. They were sharp, suspicious, and cold. The smallest voice in the room had become the loudest. The boy with nothing but honesty and courage had turned the tide. And as the courtroom sat in stunned silence, everyone knew the officer's power was collapsing, and the case had shifted forever. The silence in the courtroom stretched endlessly after the boy's final words. Everyone could feel it. The weight of truth, the sting of shame, and the collapse of a man who once believed he was untouchable. The officer sat rigid, his face pale beneath the sharp lights. His hands clenched into fists, his chest heaving, but he could not escape the reality closing in around him. The jury's eyes no longer glanced at the boy with doubt. Instead, they studied him with a strange mix of awe and respect. His innocence had become his strength, his honesty a weapon more powerful than any badge or uniform. Reporters scribbled like their pens were on fire, capturing every detail of the moment that would soon echo beyond the walls of the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his voice measured but resonant. "This child has spoken with clarity, with courage, and with truth. Let it be remembered that no age, no position, no title gives one the right to escape accountability." His gavel tapped once, not for silence, but as if to mark the boy's words into history. The boy sat quietly now, his small shoulders relaxing for the first time. The fear that had clung to him when he first climbed into the witness chair had melted away, replaced by something steadier: pride, dignity, and relief. His mother, sitting in the gallery, wiped tears from her cheeks. She whispered softly, though only she could hear it, "You did it, my son. You told the truth." The officer tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice cracked under the strain. He stuttered, stumbled, then fell silent as he realized the courtroom no longer listened. His authority, once unquestioned, had been stripped away by a child's testimony. No threats, no arrogance, no polished lies could protect him now. The power had shifted, and it rested firmly with the smallest person in the room. Around the courtroom, people lowered their eyes in shame. Some remembered how they had doubted the boy when he first walked in. Some remembered their whispers, their skepticism, their laughter at the idea that a child could matter here. Now they sat humbled, confronted by the lesson they had just witnessed. Courage has no age, and truth has no size. The boy looked at the officer one last time. His gaze was steady, not filled with hatred, but with something deeper: justice. He had been afraid, yes, but he had not broken. He had stood against the weight of the courtroom, against the power of a man in uniform, against the disbelief of strangers, and in the end he had won, not for himself alone, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. When the judge dismissed him, the boy climbed down from the chair slowly, his steps small but firm. The courtroom watched him, stunned by the way such a tiny figure had reshaped the entire trial. Each step he took felt like a victory, echoing louder than the officer's boots had when he first walked into the room. The lesson was clear. Authority can intimidate, wealth can impress, and power can silence, but none of it stands against the strength of truth spoken with courage. That day, a little boy reminded the world that bravery does not come from size, age, or uniform. Bravery comes from standing up, even when your voice shakes, even when everyone doubts you, even when you are told you don't matter. And as the boy left the courtroom, hand in hand with his mother, the silence that followed him was not doubt anymore. It was respect. A respect that none of them had shown when he first walked in. The lesson he left behind would not fade. It would linger in that room, in the memories of the jurors, in the reports printed the next day, and in the shame of a man who once believed he could never be touched. The smallest voice had delivered the loudest truth, and it shocked everyone forever. The courtroom held its breath. The boy's words still echoed, hanging in the air heavier than the judge's gavel ever could. Moments ago he had looked so small, his legs dangling from the chair, his voice trembling with fear. Now he looked like a giant in the eyes of everyone present. The officer who had walked in with confidence now sat like a shadow of himself. His shoulders hunched, his jaw clenched, his once steady eyes darting nervously as if searching for a way out. There was none. The jurors leaned back in their seats, exchanging looks that spoke louder than words. They had seen countless cases, endless streams of evidence, but never had they been struck like this. They didn't just hear testimony, they felt it. They had seen a child rise above fear and tear the mask off authority with nothing but the truth. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression stern but softened by something rare. Respect. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room. The bravery of this child will be remembered. His words will weigh heavily in this trial, not because of his age, but because of the clarity of his truth. He struck his gavel once, and the sharp sound seemed less like order and more like acknowledgement. The spectators were silent, some ashamed of how they had doubted the boy when he first walked in. A few had even smirked, expecting him to crumble. Now those same people looked down at their hands, their faces pale with regret. A woman in the gallery wiped away tears she hadn't realized were streaming down her cheeks. The boy's mother pressed her hands tightly together, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear anymore. They were tears of pride. Her son, her small, quiet son, had stood taller than men 3 times his size. He had carried the truth like a sword, and with it, he had cut through the arrogance of a system that often silenced voices like his. The defense lawyer slumped into his chair, his arguments crumbling before they ever left his lips. He had tried to twist the boy's words to make him stumble, but instead every question had only made the child's testimony stronger. The officer glanced at him desperately, but the lawyer looked away. Even he could not pretend anymore. The boy slowly climbed down from the witness chair. His small shoes tapped softly against the wooden steps, but to everyone listening, the sound was louder than thunder. With each step, the courtroom shifted further away from the officer's control, and deeper into the truth the boy had laid bare. When he reached his mother, she took his hand, squeezing it tightly. He looked up at her with wide eyes, still filled with the innocence of a child, but now carrying the strength of someone who had faced fear and spoken against it. She bent down and whispered, "You were brave. You were everything you needed to be." The courtroom doors opened, and as the boy walked out with his mother, no one dared to speak. Not because they didn't have words, but because none of them seemed big enough for what had just happened. And that was the lesson. Respect is not tied to uniforms, to wealth, or to status. Power can demand silence, but truth, especially when spoken with courage, can shatter walls that seem unbreakable. A little boy, underestimated and doubted, had shown them all that bravery does not wait for age. Courage is not measured in years, but in moments. The officer sat trapped in silence, his authority stripped away, not by a powerful lawyer or a mountain of evidence, but by a single child who refused to lie. The jurors, the judge, the spectators, they would carry that moment with them long after the trial ended. The smallest voice had shaken the mightiest wall, and the sound of it would never be forgotten.